Throughout history, there were many men and women who were executed in some of the most ruthless and brutal ways. But there were even some kings and queens who lost their lives being executed by their own people, and by governments and courts that had turned against them. Some of these monarchs were known for being tyrants, and those who were so out of touch with the suffering of their people. These monarchs were accused at times of treason against their own people, which was a crime against themselves technically or the state. Each of these monarchs had a very ruthless end. Today we look at the executions of the kings and queens of history. Welcome to the Fortress. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
Edmund was born in 841, and there are differing stories as to who his father was. It's believed he was descended from the kings of East Anglia, and when King Ethelwald died in 854, Edmund, aged around 14, succeeded onto the throne. Very little is known about his early life and reign, mostly due to the fact that the Vikings, when they devastated East Anglia, destroyed all of the charters that talked about Edmund and documented his life and what he did. It was thought that he was a good king and was a model ruler. It has been said that he treated all of his people with equality and equal justice, and that he was also very strong-willed. It's believed that he spent a year living in the coastal settlement of Hunstanton, and it was here where he devoted himself to his religion. It was against the Vikings that his downfall came. In the year 793, the Vikings raided Lindisfarne and pillaged a monastery there. They devastated the monastic community, burning down the abbey and massacring the monks who lived there, stealing all of the wealth. The raids on isolated monastic communities continued, but in 844 there was a significant large-scale attack that took place in England. The Vikings began to settle over winter in England, and a larger force appeared in the country around the year 865. This saw a huge invasion force hit the country, and specifically they landed off the east coast of England. The Vikings spent their first winter in East Anglia, before moving on and heading north to Northumbria the following year. It's believed that Edmund fought alongside King Alfred of Wessex against the Viking and Norse invaders until 869. It was said in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that here the heathen army rode across Mercia into East Anglia and took winter quarters at Thetford, and that the East Anglian King Edmund fought against them. It was said that during the battle against the Vikings, the Danish took the victory and killed the king and conquered all of the land. It's believed that against the Vikings, King Edmund was killed by the invaders, but the circumstances of his death are said to have been particularly brutal. Edmund was told to renounce his Christian faith, and he refused to do so, and allegedly he was then executed in terrifying fashion. It was said in a 10th century account that Edmund, the king of East Anglia, was tied to a tree by the Vikings. He had been beaten badly, and he cried out for Christ. However, whilst tied to the tree, the Vikings fired many different arrows into the king, peppering his body with arrows from the bows. This almost killed him, and after this he was cut away from the ropes and was then beheaded by the Danes. Another account says how King Edmund, against whom Ivar advanced, stood inside his hall and, mindful of the Saviour, threw out his weapons. The impious one then bound Edmund and insulted him, and beat him with rods, and afterwards led the devout king to a firm living tree, and tied him there with strong bonds, and beat him with whips. In between the whip lashes, Edmund called out with true belief in the Saviour Christ. Because of his belief, because he called out to Christ to aid him, the heathens became furiously angry. They then shot spears at him, as if it was just a game, until he was entirely covered with their missiles, like the bristles of a hedgehog. When Ivar, the impious pirate, saw the noble king would not forsake Christ, but with absolute faith called after him, he ordered Edmund beheaded, and the heathens did so. Whilst Edmund still called out to Christ, the heathens dragged the holy man to his death, and with one stroke struck off his head, and his soul journeyed happily to Christ. The Vikings, after conquering East Anglia and killing the king, then went on to invade Wessex. Edmund was then buried in a wooden chapel near to where he was killed, and during the reign of Athelstan, his body was moved to modern-day Bury St Edmunds. A stone abbey was built on the site that became a site of pilgrimage, and a court around St Edmund grew throughout the medieval period. His shrine became a site of great wealth, but it was destroyed during the dissolutions of the monastery in 1539 and the English Reformation. The shrine was defaced, and silver and gold worth over 5,000 marks was stolen and taken, with the abbots and monks of the abbey thrown out. Edmund the Martyr's death and execution is a brutal part of history that is rather forgotten. He was a king of East Anglia and was considered a patron saint of England. He is believed to have been a good king and a devoted one to his religion, but he met his end in a very brutal and bloody manner, being shot with arrows by the Vikings before being beheaded. Anne Boleyn caused uproar and chaos across England. Henry VIII was becoming very tired and fed up with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and she could not provide him with the son he greatly wished for. Catherine and Henry's marriage produced only one child that survived, the later Queen Mary I, or Bloody Mary. But Henry was desperate for a male heir, and he began to have his eye caught by Anne Boleyn. Anne arrived at court and was seen as a captivating young lady, and Henry quickly made advances towards her, despite still being married. Anne rejected him a number of times, and this was incredibly frustrating for him, and Henry was forced to wait until he had sorted out an annulment with Catherine. Both Anne and Henry exchanged gifts, but the king's great matter plagued him, and it was a time where no one could get a divorce, let alone a king. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, was a proud Catholic European regent, and she believed her marriage with Henry was sacred. Henry tried everything to erase his and Catherine's marriage, as he dreamed of Anne Boleyn. Henry tried to appeal to the Pope for a divorce or an annulment, and he even said he'd sinned by marrying his dead brother's wife. The Pope would not give up, and he banned Henry from marrying again until the decision came about his first marriage. Cardinal Wolsey was ordered to get a solution and to get the king his divorce, but Wolsey could not do this, and he also fell from grace, but passed away before he could have been executed. But Henry took action into his own hands, and in 1531 he banished Catherine from court and took her royal chambers and quarters away and gifted them to Anne Boleyn. This was seen as disgraceful, and it caused chaos across England, and Anne was almost nearly seized by an angry mob at one point. Henry allowed Anne to perform many of the roles a queen would, even despite not being one, and she was given a peerage which made her very rich and also benefited her family, with the Boleyns becoming incredibly powerful and wealthy. Anne was the apple of Henry's eye, and she was married to the king in secret on the 14th of November 1532, and it's alleged she then became pregnant after this. There was a second wedding, but then a trial decreed that Henry's marriage to Catherine was in fact a sin and invalid. 5 days after, the marriage of Henry and Anne was declared valid, and Catherine of Aragon was stripped of her queenship. Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen Consort on the 1st of June 1533 at a large ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It was clear that Anne was pregnant. There was hope that she would give birth to a son and a new heir to the throne, but following the ceremony, she was paraded throughout the streets, but large amounts of the population disliked her. The Pope excommunicated Henry because of this, and he condemned the marriage of Henry and Anne, and the Pope tried to cause more issues. The king forced all of his advisors and close friends to accept the active succession, and also that Anne was the rightful queen, and forced them to turn their back on the Pope. A number of Henry's closest friends and advisors, such as Thomas More, could not accept this, and they paid for this with their lives. It was said that Henry was also the supreme head of the church, and that he had authority on the church within England and not the Pope. This religious turmoil was caused all by Anne Boleyn's marriage with the king, but Anne also began to acknowledge Protestantism and promoted this within her court. But Anne was then sent to Greenwich Palace to await the birth of her child. There was much hope that this was a son, but a daughter Elizabeth was born, and despite Elizabeth going on to become one of the best queens England has ever had, this was not what the king wanted. This disappointed Henry VIII, but he was prepared to try again for the male heir. Anne was seen as a lavish spender at court, and she had a number of household staff that performed different roles, and even had 60 maids of honour. Her and the king's relationship was happy, and she oversaw court spending large amounts of money on luxuries and decorations. But Henry was obsessed with his desire for a son, and following a miscarriage in 1534, Henry discussed the idea of divorcing Anne Boleyn for the first time. He had spoken to Cranmer and Cromwell about this, but then the idea disappeared for a while. Anne became pregnant yet again, and continued to hope for a son that would get her out of immediate danger, but the king began to grow tired of her. As Henry had broken from Rome, he was free to do as he pleased, and this would have made Anne's position rather tenuous and uneasy. It was around this time that Henry began to look towards Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. He gifted Jane a locket with a portrait of them both inside, and Jane wound up Anne by continuing to open and close this whilst in her company. Anne was so angry that she ripped this off Jane and cut her fingers doing so. But around this time, Henry had a very horrible jousting accident at a tournament where he was knocked out for 2 hours, and it's believed that the stress of this caused Anne to miscarry a baby that many believed was a son. When Henry later recovered, this was the start of the end for Anne and Henry. Henry, driven by the desire for a male heir, was fed up with the miscarriages Anne had, and he said he fell under her witchcraft and spells, and because of this she was forced out of the royal apartments. Henry then put Thomas Cromwell to task to get him to find a way out of the marriage. Cromwell crafted an expert web of lies and deceit against Anne Boleyn, which saw her being accused of treason, incest and adultery with a number of other men. Cromwell used all of his experience of Tudor politics to target Anne at court, and he interrogated those on the periphery of Anne's circle, and he managed to get evidence that he believed could bring the Queen's downfall. A number of men were arrested, including her own brother George. All of the men accused were executed in bloody fashion, including her brother, and Anne was indicted on charges and was taken to the Tower of London on the 2nd of May 1536. When she arrived at the prison, she broke down asking for her father. She was tried along with her brother inside the Tower of London, and all of those accused, including Anne, were sentenced to death. Anne's trial was a sham, and all of the evidence it's believed was false and manufactured. The men accused with her were executed on the 17th of May 1536 on Tower Hill, but it was said that Anne inside the tower was at peace with her impending death. She could have been burned at the stake, but the king commuted her death sentence to a simpler beheading, fetching a French swordsman to perform the execution, as he believed it would be more reliable. On the day of her execution, the constable of the tower, William Kingston, wrote, "This morning she sent for me, that I might be with her at such time as she received the good Lord, to the intent I should hear her speak as touching her innocency, always to be clear." It was said that Anne said, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck," and then she put her hands about it laughing heartily. "I have seen many men and also women executed, and they have been in great sorry, and to my knowledge this lady has much joy in death." Before dawn, on the 19th of May, she had called the constable of the tower to hear mass with her, and she prayed she had never been unfaithful to the king. She was given the sacrament, and she was told to ready herself, as the executioner was waiting. She left the royal apartments inside of the tower, and was surrounded by 4 servants, who followed Kingston to the scaffold at 9 o'clock. She was dressed in a red petticoat, and was joined by 2 female attendants, making her final walk from the Queen's house to the scaffold. It was said that she seemed positive, then she made a short speech on the scaffold. Anne Boleyn was allowed to be executed in private inside the Tower of London, being spared the eyes of the public on Tower Hill. But there were a large number of people who were there to witness the beheading of the Queen. Anne said to the crowd, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the King, and send him long to reign over you. He was ever good, gentle, and sovereign Lord. This I take my leave of the world and of all you, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." It was said that her speech had a profound effect on the crowd, and her voice wavered in weakness at times. Anne made a number of people cry, and then her ladies prepared her for her execution. She thanked her women for their service, and told them to pray for her, and the executioner then asked for his forgiveness, and Anne handed him a sack of coins as payment. One of her ladies then placed a blindfold over her eyes, and she knelt and said her final prayers. She seemed dazed as she knelt on her knees in the straw, and she faced the crowd and said, "O Christ, receive my spirit." She did look scared, and her women then began to cry at the scenes. Within seconds, a few more prayers were said, and then the executioner unleashed his sword from a lump of hay to gasps in the crowd. In one blow, he struck Queen Anne Boleyn's head clean off, and she lost her life. Her head fell into the straw, and it was covered by a white handkerchief, and cannons along Tower Wharf fired, marking the execution of Anne Boleyn. Thomas Cromwell was even there himself to witness the proceedings, and then her head and body were taken by her ladies to dispose of it. They placed her body and head in an arrow chest, and this was then taken inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula for burial. Anne Boleyn's death and execution was incredibly sad and was manufactured expertly by Thomas Cromwell, and it was incredibly shocking. Her downfall was linked with failed pregnancies and the fact she could not produce a son that Henry VIII wanted so badly. But it's ultimately the king's wandering eye that secured her downfall and death. Today she's seen as a tragic second wife of King Henry VIII and a victim of the king's brutal side. Lady Jane Grey was born around 1537 in Bradgate Park in Leicestershire. She had a fine and brilliant humanist education and was stated to have been one of the most learned young women of her time. She was a great-granddaughter of Henry VII, so she had royal blood, and she directly inherited the crown from her cousin, Edward VI, on the 9th of July 1553. Edward VI, Henry VIII's son, had fallen very ill in January 1553, and ever since then he seemed frail, and despite being only young, he wished to make sure that his successor was a male Protestant. Because of this, he disinherited his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, and he looked towards his cousins as successors, but none had produced a male heir. But due to her strong Protestant faith, he turned to Lady Jane Grey, the eldest Grey child, to become his successor. Jane, it was said, would reign as queen, but the crown at the time could only go to a male heir. It was said that if Jane died without having a son, then the crown would pass further to one of the sons of her sisters, and this was signed off by the Privy Council. Edward's new plan caused a significant degree of changes. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, sought to manipulate his way into power and the throne by marrying Lady Jane Grey to his son Lord Guildford Dudley. Because of this marriage, John Dudley himself was placed in a very strong position and could for his daughter-in-law get what he wanted. Lady Jane and Guildford would have reigned together as king and queen, and when she was 16 Jane married and Guildford was around 2 years older. Their match was seen as beneficial to both the Dudleys and the Greys, as with the new law around succession, it was believed that future Grey children would rule over England. It was John Dudley, Guildford's father, who was involved in getting Edward VI to pass over the throne, but when Edward died on the 6th of July 1553, Jane was immediately summoned. She was taken to Sion House, where she was informed that she was going to be crowned the Queen of England. This surprised the young Jane, and she became very distressed at the time, and this confused her privy councillors. Becoming queen was seen as a good thing, but it's believed that Jane was not prepared for this, and neither did she wish to become the queen. She became very distressed, and this continued even when her husband and parents arrived. She was very reluctant to become queen, but the following day Jane, along with her parents and Guildford, went to the Tower of London with her entourage. A procession of barges took her to the Tower along the Thames, where plans were being drawn up for her coronation. It was tradition for English kings and queens to stay briefly inside the Tower to await their coronations, and this had been done for centuries. When entering, Jane wore a long green dress of velvet, and looked every part the Queen, wearing very extravagant jewellery. She would never leave the Tower's walls. Jane was asked to wear the crown, but she refused to do so, but her husband Guildford had strong ambitions to become the ruler, unlike his reluctant wife. Jane continued to refuse to make him king, which angered him greatly. Jane also had a number of problems with her husband, but her biggest problem would come in the form of Henry VIII's eldest child, Mary. Mary had learned of the fact that Jane had been made successor, and she saw her as a usurper, and Mary wrote to the Privy Council, demanding that she should be the Queen as the rightful heir. Many members of the Privy Council believed that support for Mary would be futile and would easily be defeated, and they also sent a reply demanding that Mary should back Jane, and told her to silence herself. Mary refused to do so, and she had a large amount of Catholic support. She was a major threat to Jane, and an army was even sent from London to go and capture Mary. Princess Mary raised her own army, and John Dudley was told to go and capture her so she could be silenced. But whilst Dudley was out fighting Mary's army, the Privy Council changed their minds and switched their vital support from Lady Jane Grey to the woman who would be known as Queen Mary I. Mary was proclaimed Queen after riding victorious into London on the 19th of July, ending the 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey. The place which Jane was supposed to be enjoying the luxuries of being a queen, the Tower of London, now became her prison. She was imprisoned in the Tower's gentleman jailer's apartments, along with her husband, who was being held in the Beauchamp Tower. Inside this tower in particular is some interesting prison graffiti saying the words Jane, and this could even have been done by Guildford himself. As Mary I held Jane prisoner, she was left with no one, as all the Privy Councillors sought to impress Mary and save their own skin. Jane and Guildford were soon placed on trial for high treason. Mary I, as Queen, offered both of them a reprieve, believing that the pair were nothing more than pawns in the manipulations of more powerful men who sought to exert their own control. Jane, because of this, was granted a number of comforts, and she was allowed a number of servants to attend upon her. She was also allowed to take walks inside of the Queen's gardens, and to meet up with her husband there. When her trial came, there were a number of other defendants, including her husband, and all of those brought to trial were found guilty. Jane, along with all defendants, including her husband, was sentenced to death. It was believed that Jane, as she signed a number of documents as Jane the Queen, assumed the role of Queen and the title of it, and with this was guilty of being treasonous. Jane received a sentence that she was to be burned alive on Tower Hill, or beheaded as the Queen pleases, but it was later reported that Lady Jane Grey's life had been spared by Mary I. But this leniency did not last long at all. The Queen's religious beliefs and the plans Mary had to marry the hated Prince Philip of Spain made her incredibly unpopular in England. Because of this, there was a great fear, had by Mary, that a Protestant rebellion could see her overthrown and assassinated, and at the expense of Lady Jane Grey, who would become the Queen. A number of rebellions did break out across England, with the most serious being Wyatt's rebellion. The conspirators in this did not explicitly state that they intended to put Jane on the throne, but her father was linked closely to the plot. Mary then knew that to keep Jane alive was too dangerous for her, and she decided to offer her an ultimatum. Mary said to Jane she would spare her life if Jane and her husband converted to Catholicism, and they would support Mary, but Jane refused to do so, and with this, Mary signed Guildford and Jane's death warrants and ordered their executions. It was a cold February morning that Jane first witnessed the power and brutality of Mary I. On the 12th of February 1554, prison guards took Guildford Dudley, Jane's husband, from the Beauchamp Tower out towards Tower Hill. The short walk was accompanied by thousands who came to witness the beheading of Lady Jane Grey's husband, the man who wished so greatly to become king. Jane refused to meet him one final time, and she worried it would be too hard for both of them to say goodbye. Guildford was taken to Tower Hill and was beheaded in front of a huge crowd in an execution that told the public of London to fall into line and support Mary I. As Jane gazed out of a window at the tower where she was sitting, she saw a horse and cart bring back the remains of her husband into the Tower of London, with his head separated from his body. Jane saw her husband's corpse and cried and wailed, distressed by what she saw. Mary did allow Jane some reprieve during her execution, and as she was a former Queen of England and a woman of high status, Mary consented to allow her to be executed in private within the walls of the Tower of London. This spared her being taken out of the tower and being executed in front of the public. An hour after she had witnessed her husband's remains being brought into the tower to be buried inside the chapel, Jane was summoned by the tower's guards. They knocked on the door of her chamber and told her she was due to die within the next few moments. Jane prepared, dressed in black, then she left her room and was escorted to Tower Green. On this small area of grass, bloodshed was sown into the lawn, with the executions of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, two former queens, being beheaded on the spot. She walked calmly and slowly to the scaffold, and she made her final speech to those few witnesses who were sent to watch the proceedings. Jane said, "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned to the same." The fact indeed against the Queen's Highness was unlawful, and the consenting thereunto by me, but touching the procurement and desire thereof by me, or on my behalf, I do wash my hands thereof in innocency, before God and the fact of you, good Christian people, this day. Jane then read Psalm 51, written in her prayer book, and turned to one of her ladies and gave her gloves, handkerchief, collar, and gown. The prayer book was then passed to the lieutenant of the Tower, and she turned to her executioner, who was armed with his axe, and said, "Please dispatch me quickly." Jane, up until this point, had faced her mortality with calm and resolve, but as panic set in, this waned. The executioner tied a blindfold around her eyes, and Jane then panicked and started looking for the block to rest her head, and she cried, "What shall I do? Where is it?" And this would have been very distressing for people to have seen. The young teenage girl on her hands and knees scrambling for the executioner's block. A witness then helped her lay her head on the block, and she said, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit," before in one swift blow, Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day Queen's head, was taken off by the axeman. Lady Jane Grey today is seen as the shortest reigning monarch in English history, but she's also viewed as an innocent victim in the scheming of a number of men who sought to claim power for themselves and manipulate her. She's seen as a Protestant martyr who was offered the chance to convert to Catholicism, but she stayed loyal to her faith and beliefs. But at the age of just 16 or 17, Lady Jane Grey was executed in one of the most barbaric ways. Henry VIII in his last will and testament excluded the Stuarts from succeeding to the English throne, but in the eyes of many Catholics, Elizabeth I, who came onto the throne following Mary I, was illegitimate. Her mother was Anne Boleyn, and when she married Henry, this caused chaos and forced through the English Reformation, as the Pope would not grant Henry his divorce or annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Anne was later beheaded inside of the Tower of London on the King's orders, and as Elizabeth was the daughter of her, it was believed she was illegitimate and barred from the throne because of this. Catholics believed that Mary Stuart, the Scottish Queen, and also the rightful Queen of Scotland, being the most senior legitimate descendant of Henry VII, through her grandmother Margaret Tudor, was the rightful Queen of England. Mary, through her turbulent and tragic love life, was eventually driven out of Scotland, as there was much treachery and plotting against her. She had ruled for a number of years, but her second husband, Lord Darnley, was a man who wished to take power himself. He was deemed weak and with no authority, and he became jealous of Mary's closeness with her secretary David Rizzio, and then had him murdered in front of the 6-month pregnant Mary in bloody scenes. Darnley was later killed, but then she married the man who it's believed was responsible for the death of her second husband, and for this she was forced off the throne, and her son James became the King of Scotland. Mary was imprisoned in a castle in Scotland, but in May 1568 she managed to escape and flee to England. She was placed under guard by Elizabeth I when she came to England, and throughout the next 18 years of her life she was held as a prized prisoner of the English Queen, and was moved to a number of locations and castles around the country. This was done to protect her, as it was believed that Catholics would break her out of prison. Mary's presence in England gave Elizabeth a headache, as the Catholics were already unhappy with her approach to religion, and there was a genuine worry that there would be an uprising, and that Mary would be freed and would be the figurehead of a Catholic rebellion to oust or even assassinate the Protestant Queen Elizabeth. Many Catholics genuinely believed Mary should have been the Queen, and Elizabeth and her courts became very suspicious of her. Elizabeth was aware that she was the target of a number of assassination plots, and there were 3 significant ones involving Mary Queen of Scots and the death of Elizabeth. In 1571, the Ridolfi plot planned this, as did the Throckmorton plot in 1583, and then 3 years later the most significant plot to kill Elizabeth, involving Mary, would come. The Babington plot, led by Anthony Babington, planned to break Mary out of prison, and then put her on the throne of England by also assassinating Elizabeth I. Mary and Babington wrote letters to each other, discussing the plan, and Mary subsequently gave her permission for the plan to go ahead. But these letters were intercepted by Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth I's spymaster, and Mary's involvement in the plan could not be disputed. Because of this, she was technically guilty of treason, but Elizabeth was very hesitant to order the execution of her cousin and an anointed queen, especially the one whose country borders England. The problem was that Elizabeth did not really have a choice, as having Mary alive was too dangerous, even as she was held captive for almost 20 years. She could not send her into exile, or return her back to Scotland either, but eventually was convinced to sign her death warrant. Mary in the meantime was moved to Fotheringhay Castle, where she was held as the Queen's prisoner. She had been placed on trial there, being found guilty of treason, and on the 1st of February 1587, finally the death warrant was signed. On the 7th of February, a number of representatives from Queen Elizabeth arrived at Fotheringhay, where Mary was held prisoner, and they informed her of her impending execution that would take place on the next morning at between 7 and 8 o'clock. Her jailer was ordered to prepare everything for her death, and Mary, hearing this, it's believed was relieved that her years in prison and reduced freedom would come to an end. She said she had been prepared for death ever since she arrived in England and was taken prisoner. Mary had enough of her treatment, but did ask the men for some time to get her affairs in order, but then she was cut down and this was refused. It was said that Mary's execution could not be delayed a moment beyond that time. In her final hours, Mary Queen of Scots wrote to her friends and family, saying goodbye to her ladies, and also she spent some time in prayer. On the morning of the 8th of February 1587, she was summoned from her room for her execution. Inside the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, a scaffold had been created that was covered in black cloth. It was reached by a couple of small steps, and on the scaffold was a block, and a cushion for Mary to kneel on as she lay her head on it. There were also 3 stools, one for her and the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, who were sent to watch the execution. Mary, when she entered Fotheringhay's great hall, entered full of majesty and grace, as if she was attending a ball or dance, and not her own death. As she got close to the scaffold, she asked for help climbing up the stairs, and then she asked officers to allow her priest to remain with her, but this was refused. She was offered a Protestant minister, but this was seen by Mary as a final insult to her wishes and her faith. She was advised to carry the cross of Christ in her heart rather than in her hand, and she prayed that England and Scotland would be converted to the Catholic Church once more. Mary then summoned her ladies-in-waiting to help her prepare for her final moments. She had her ladies remove her black veil, her headdress and other jewellery. The executioner tried to help, but Mary raged, forcing the man back, saying that he could not touch her. When Mary's ladies helped her, they revealed that she was wearing a velvet petticoat and sleeves of crimson brown, the colour that symbolised she would become a Catholic martyr. Her executioner, a man named Bull, and his assistant, as was customary, then begged for Mary's forgiveness, and the Queen granted him this, and she hoped that any sins she had would be forgiven by God. She wore a golden crucifix, which was allegedly made from wood from the true cross, and she wished to give this to one of her ladies, but the executioner prevented this. She then told her ladies to go, and made the sign of the cross to them. They were all distressed, and one in particular burst into tears, but Mary reassured her, and then they were told to go and pray for Mary's soul. Jane Kennedy, one of her ladies, then gave the Queen of Scots a white handkerchief and blindfolded Mary. She then briskly knelt down at the block and said, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend thy spirit," in Latin, and then Mary stretched out her arms, giving the executioner the sign that she was ready to die. Mary's execution did not go as planned. Inside of the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, the executioner made a mess of Mary's death. She was not beheaded with one strike of the axe. The first blow came crushing down from the axe and missed her neck, and instead struck the back of her head, causing a terrible wound to her skull. The second strike from the axe almost severed her neck completely, apart from a small piece of sinew that held her head still to her body. Following this, the executioner then cut through the sinew like a saw with his axe, and he then held Mary Queen of Scots' head to the crowd. As he held it up, he said, "God save the Queen," but Mary's auburn hair he was holding was in fact a wig. With this, Mary's head fell from the air onto the floor, with the executioner holding the wig. It was said that Mary actually had very short grey hair, and her head rolled towards the edge of the scaffold. It was noted that her lips stirred up and down for a quarter of an hour after her head was cut off. After the beheading of Mary, anything that belonged to the Queen or was touched by her was burned inside the fireplace of the Great Hall, to prevent any relics being collected from her. After hearing that the execution had gone ahead, Elizabeth I was raging and furious, and she greatly regretted the death of Mary until the day she died. Mary's body was embalmed and left in a lead coffin, before being buried in a Protestant service inside of Peterborough Cathedral. The Protestant service would have been against Mary's wishes, but her body was later exhumed and reinterred during the reign of her son as King of England and Scotland, and it was placed in Westminster Abbey, opposite the tomb of Elizabeth I. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots was a botched one, in which the executioner performed his office poorly. The event was very shocking, as one queen had ordered the death and signed off on the execution of another anointed queen. In a time in which many people believed that monarchs were sent by God to rule, this was seen as Elizabeth executing someone sent by God to rule over people. But what was clear was the fact that Mary did in fact comply with plots to break her out of prison, and agreed to plots to overthrow Elizabeth. Yes, this is treason, but it's believed because of the desperation and frustration she had being imprisoned for almost 2 decades that Mary complied with this. Mary Queen of Scots was probably desperate to secure her freedom, something of which Elizabeth I would never grant her.
Charles I was having a number of issues with Parliament during his reign. They were fierce enemies, and the king believed he had been given a divine right to rule by God, and that no one could challenge him. But Parliament were concerned about a number of policies the king had, and the fact he was spending large amounts of money and making terrible decisions. With this, Parliament quickly seized London, and Charles fled the capital for Hampton Court Palace. But within a few months, in mid-1642, Parliament and the king had begun to arm, and they both raised armies to fight against each other. Negotiations broke down and Charles raised the royal standard in Nottingham, going to war with Parliament. After a number of battles, it was clear that things were going poorly for the king, and Parliament managed to seize Charles I. He was held under house arrest and did manage to escape Hampton Court at one point, but he was then quickly arrested again and was held on the Isle of Wight. Charles had no chance of winning the war, and Oliver Cromwell refused any further talks with the king. They regarded as a bloody tyrant, and with this they were acting quickly to secure their own power. Charles I was moved to a number of castles, and was sent to Windsor Castle, where he was indicted for treason, and he was then brought to trial. He was accused of using his own power for his own gain, rather than what was good for his country. It was said that he, for accomplishment of such his designs, and for protecting of himself and his adherents in his and their wicked practices, to the same ends, hath traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present Parliament and the people therein represented, and that wicked design, wars, and evil practices of him, the said Charles Stuart, have been, and are carried on for the advancement of upholding of the personal interest of will, power, and pretended prerogative to himself and his family against the public interest, common right, liberty, justice, and peace of the people of this nation. It was estimated that around 300,000 people and 6% of the population died during the Civil War, and Parliament thought he was guilty of all treasons, murders, burnings, spoils, desolations, damages, and mischiefs to the nation, acted and committed in the said wars, or occasioned thereby. Charles refused to plead and claimed the trial was illegal, and he said, "No earthly power can justly call me, who am your king, in question as a delinquent. This day proceeding cannot be warranted by God's laws, for, on the contrary, the authority of obedience unto kings is clearly warranted and strictly commanded in both the Old and New Testament. For the law of this land, I am no less confident, that no learned lawyer will affirm that an impeachment can lie against a king. They all going in his name, and one of their maxims is, that the king can do no wrong. The higher house is totally excluded, and for the House of Commons, it is too well known that the major part of them are detained or deterred from sitting. The arms I took up were only to defend the fundamental laws of this kingdom against those who have supposed my power have totally changed the ancient government." He was then removed from the court, and then over the next few days was sentenced to death, and 59 commissioners signed Charles I's death warrant, including Cromwell. Charles I did not have long before his death sentence was carried out, and the execution occurred on the 30th of January 1649. The scaffold was built outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, and Charles spent his final days praying. He also burned his personal papers and correspondence, and he was allowed to see his two youngest children, Elizabeth and Henry, for one last time. He told Elizabeth to remain Protestant and stay true, and that Henry should not become king if he is approached to do so by Parliament. He split his jewels between his children, and then had a restless last night. He woke up early on the day of his execution, and began to get dressed at 5 a.m. in all black in his blue garter sash. He spent a while getting dressed, and gave further instruction as to what should happen with his final artefacts and possessions. He was given an extra shirt so the crowd would not see him shiver on the cold morning, and at 10 a.m. he was summoned to go to Whitehall for his execution. He drank a glass of wine and ate some bread at noon, but outside the banqueting house a huge crowd had gathered outside the platform where Charles's execution would take place. The scaffold was covered in black material, and the execution block was very low, much lower than a normal block. This was so low that the king would have practically had to lie on the floor for his head to be taken off. At 2 p.m. the king was called to the scaffold, and he emerged through the window of the banqueting house and climbed onto the scaffold. One onlooker stated that it was the saddest sight England ever saw. He looked at the crowd and saw a huge barrier of guards, which would prevent him from being heard if he made a speech, so he spoke to one of his attendants on the scaffold, who recorded his final words. Charles said, "As for the people, truly I desire their liberty and freedom, as much as whosoever, but I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having of government by those laws, by which their lives and their goods may be most their own. It is not for them to have a share in government, that is nothing, sirs, appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clearly different things, and therefore until that be done, I mean until the people be put into that liberty which I speak of, certainly they will never enjoy themselves." He also said he would go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown in heaven. He said one final word to an attendant who gave him a silk nightcap to put on so his hair did not trouble the axeman. Charles said, "Remember," before he then laid his neck onto the low block, and then he readied himself. Quickly the executioner then struck, and in one clean blow from the axe, the executioner took his head clean off. The executioner then held up the head of the king to silence, and he did not declare the king as a traitor, and following the execution it's believed there was an audible groan, and that the people who witnessed it were not happy with what happened. The king's head was then dropped into the crowd, and a number of soldiers rushed to it and dipped their handkerchiefs in Charles's blood, and they then cut off his hair. The body was then put into a coffin, and this was covered with black velvet. There are a number of people who are suspected of being the person who executed the king. The most probable candidate for the job was Richard Brandon, who was a common hangman at the time. Charles's execution was done by clearly a man who was very skilled and who had cleanly cut off a number of heads, as he did do a successful job. He also executed other key royalists, but Brandon did refuse that he did this initially, but allegedly confessed to being the executioner of the king on his deathbed. The identity of the executioner and his assistant was kept private, and this was done to protect them, as they believed there would be a significant amount of backlash, and many of the usual axemen inside of the capital refused to do the job of killing the king. Many people in England believed they had killed a martyr and a man who was sent by God to rule over the country. In Europe, many people reacted negatively to the event, and many claimed that Cromwell was nothing but a regicide and a usurper who had committed a heinous act in organising the king's execution. The event today is still seen as rather controversial, and many consider Charles I to have been a victim of Cromwell and the effects of the English Civil War, but others consider him to have been an evil monarch who did nothing but act in his own interests. But the execution of King Charles I has to be one of the most shocking and significant events in English history.
King Louis ascended onto the throne in 1774 when he was 19 years old, and he inherited a country already in turmoil. At the time, the government was grossly in debt, and there was a growing resentment in France of the monarchy. He doubted his ability to deal with issues, and he did wish to be liked by the population, saying, "It may be considered politically unwise, but it seems to me to be a general wish, and I want to be loved." He was determined to do his best and to be a good king, and he wished to consult the public on a number of affairs, but his reign was plagued with poor decisions, scandal and economic suffering. Louis did accept attempts by his ministers to relieve the economic issues in France, but one of the biggest issues was that Louis was in support of the colonists in the American War of Independence, and by providing financial support to them, it plunged France to the verge of bankruptcy. He himself was seen as a big spender in the country, and at the time his population were beginning to suffer greatly. There was a crisis with people not being able to afford food and to pay for it, leading to people starving. In a last-ditch attempt to solve the financial problems, Louis assembled the Estates General, the national assembly that represented the free estates or classes of the French people, the nobility, the clergy and the commoners. This had not been gathered for over 170 years, but the commoners used it to declare itself the National Assembly, and beginning the spark of the French Revolution. To the French people, Louis and his queen Marie Antoinette were seen as lavish spenders, and Marie also began to become a figure of hatred, as she was known for spending huge sums of the country's money on decorations, furniture, clothes, and extravagant things for herself. Whilst the people were suffering, Marie and Louis were having banquets, and this was seen as grossly inappropriate. The storming of the Bastille occurred on the 14th of July 1789, where protesters in Paris stormed the state prison, seen as a symbol of the monarchy's power, and they broke in to ransack the prison and to steal weapons and ammunition. This was seen as a huge moment in the revolution, and things continued to go downhill after this. In October 1789, an angry mob marched on Versailles and forced the royal couple to move. Louis tried to escape in June 1791, and this was seen that he was betraying the French people and consulting with foreign powers to deal with the rebels, but he was captured and was forced to accept a new constitution. In August 1792, the royal couple were arrested and were then imprisoned separately. Louis was arrested on the 13th of August and was sent to the Temple, an ancient fortress used in Paris as a prison, and within weeks the National Assembly declared France a republic and abolished the monarchy. The king was kept under arrest and was seen as a hostage, but he was also seen as dangerous, as it was predicted invading forces would try and save him. Evidence was found about his negotiations with Austria and other foreign countries, and for this the king was placed on trial. On the 11th of December 1792, he was taken from his prison to stand before the Convention and to hear the charges put before him. Before the trial began, he tried to mount his defence, and he told his lawyers that he knew he would be found guilty and would be killed. He was resigned to accept his fate, and he knew what was coming, but he wanted to go down fighting. There were 3 questions that the Convention were voting on. The first was, is Louis guilty? The second was, should there be an appeal to the people? And the third was, what should the punishment be for him? On the 15th of January 1793, the Convention began to vote, and in total it took 36 hours to reach a decision. Louis was found overwhelmingly guilty, but there was a significant problem as to what the punishment should be. By just one vote, the sentence of death was passed for Louis, and he was condemned to death by just one single vote. A reprieve was voted down the next day, and it was voted that his execution should be conducted as swiftly as possible. His execution was scheduled for the 21st of January 1793, and his death sentence was rather controversial. To many it was seen as bringing the long-awaited end of the 1,000-year period of absolute monarchy in France, and the beginning of democracy in the nation. Others saw it as a senseless act of bloodshed, and that it showed France was heading towards a violent and immoral society. On the morning of his execution, Louis woke early. He dressed with the help of his valet, Jean-Baptiste Clary, and he then went to meet with an Irish priest, Henry Essex Edgeworth, and made his last confession. Here he heard his last mass and was given communion. The priest advised Louis to avoid saying goodbye to his family, as it would be too difficult, and at 7 o'clock he passed his final wishes on to the priest. The royal seal was to go to the Dauphin, and his wedding ring to Marie, his queen. He then went to meet the commander of the guard, and in the second court a green carriage waited for him. He climbed aboard it, with the priest and 2 guards who sat opposite them. The carriage carrying the king left Temple at 9 o'clock, and for more than an hour drummers played to drown out any support that there was for the king. They then escorted the carriage through Paris. The route was lined with 80,000 men at arms, and the cavalry who led the carriage had their sabres drawn. There was a plot to try and break the king out to save him by royalists, but this never came to anything. At 10 o'clock the carriage arrived at the Place de la Révolution, and here a scaffold had been created with a guillotine standing on it. It was surrounded by soldiers, who had guns and drums, and also a crowd who were armed with pikes and bayonets. He was approached by the executioner Sanson, who along with his assistants tied Louis's hands together. The king's hair was then cut to ensure that the execution went swiftly, and he then removed his shirt collar and was led up to the scaffold by the executioner. It was said by his priest that the path leading to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness with which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment, when arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold, silenced by his look alone. 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud they must have been heard, I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: "I die innocent of all crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." Whilst on the scaffold, Louis tried to give a long speech, but a drum roll was ordered, and this led to his execution being quickened. The noise made his speech hard to understand, and with this he was then fastened quickly to the guillotine's bench. With Louis strapped to the board, he was then swiftly slid under the guillotine's yoke to hold his head in place. Once a signal was given that he was in position, the blade was released, and it quickly beheaded him. The executioner Sanson then grabbed the severed head of the king out of the basket, where it fell, and showed it to the cheering crowd. One report said that the blade did not sever his neck, and instead cut through the back of his skull and into his jaw, but as the king's head was shown, a number of the crowd rushed to the scaffold to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood. Executioner Charles Henry Sanson told of the events that day. Arriving at the foot of the guillotine, Louis XVI looked for a moment at the instruments of his execution and asked why the drums had stopped beating. He came forward to speak, but there were shouts to the executioners to get on with their work. As he was strapped down, he exclaimed, "My people, I die innocent." Then turning towards his executioners, Louis declared, "Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French." The blade fell. It was 10:22 a.m. One of the assistants of Sanson then showed the head of Louis to the people, whereupon a huge cry of "Vive la Nation! Vive la Republique!" arose, and an artillery salute rang out, which reached the ears of the imprisoned royal family. Another account recited to French author Victor Hugo stated, "Here are some unknown details. The executioners numbered 4. 2 only performed the execution, the third stayed at the foot of the ladder, and the fourth was on the wagon, which was to convey the king's body to the Madeleine cemetery, and which was waiting a few feet from the scaffold. The executioners wore breeches, coats in the French style as the Revolution had modified it, and 3-cornered hats with enormous tricolour cockades. They executed the king with their hats on, and it was without taking his hat off that Sanson, seizing by the hair the severed head of Louis XVI, showed it to the people, and for a few moments let the blood from it trickle upon the scaffold. Louis XVI's body was then transported to the old church of the Madeleine, and it was buried. It was said that arriving at the cemetery I called for silence. A detachment of gendarmes showed us the body. It was clothed in a white vest and grey silk breeches with matching stockings. We chanted Vespers and the service for the dead. In pursuance of an executive order, the body lying in its open coffin was then thrown onto a bed of quicklime at the bottom of the pit and covered by the earth, the whole being firmly and throughoutly tampered down. Louis XVI's head was placed at his feet. Later his remains and his queen's were reburied together inside the Basilica of Saint Denis. The execution of King Louis XVI was a pivotal moment in the history of France. It symbolised the end of the corrupt monarch that had been bleeding the country dry in the subsequent decades before, and the beginning of the revolution that led to democracy. France did suffer in the years following, with turmoil and many more executions coming, but the king's, along with his wife's, was seen as the most significant. Born on the 2nd of November 1755 in Vienna, Austria, Maria Antonia was the youngest daughter of the ruler of the Habsburg Empire, Empress Maria Theresa, and her husband Francis I, the Holy Roman Emperor. It was clear that she was destined to live a lavish lifestyle, and she spent her early years living in the royal Austrian palaces. She was well educated, however teachers commented on her lack of aptitude for learning, and she was rather poor at writing in different languages, and was also poor at speaking different languages. For princesses, mastering different languages was extremely important, as the hope was that they would marry a prince or king from a different country to forge alliances, and this did not stand Maria in good stead. She was a talented musician, preferring more practical things than the academic, and it was said that her heart and character were excellent. In February 1770, Louis XV of France requested the hand of Maria for a match with his oldest surviving grandson, Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France. This was accepted to seal an alliance between the nations, and the Dauphin and Maria became engaged and then married by proxy. She met her husband on the 14th of May 1770 at Versailles, and there was a mixed reaction to the marriage. Marie initially was liked by the French people, but some did oppose the alliance with Austria. Following the death of Louis XV, the Dauphin became King Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette became the Queen of France. She initially had little influence over her husband, but received extremely lavish gifts from the king. Allegedly, one chateau she was gifted was renovated with the walls covered in diamonds and gold, and she continued to spend extremely heavily on luxuries. At the time, France was suffering greatly from financial problems, and the people of France were in great hardship, with many being even unable to buy bread for their family. Because of this, many poor people were dying, but in the face of this, Marie the Queen kept spending huge sums of money on her dresses, hairstyles, luxuries and furniture. There were riots in France, and she began to become a figure of hatred, even being blamed for the economic crisis. Everyone could see what she was doing, but Marie ignored it. Her husband Louis was also suffering. A number of blunders had lent him poorly to the French population. The couple did have children, but problems in France still remained. There was a celebration, especially with the birth of the Dauphin, but Marie also became involved in European politics. At court she promoted her favourites, and it's alleged had affairs with high-up members of society, but leaflets about the Queen's sexual deviance emerged across France. Allegations of the Queen having affairs and illicit behaviour was levelled against her, including accusations of affairs with women. With this, her mother feared for her daughter's safety, but things continued, spending large amounts of money, buying property and living the high life. More allegations emerged too regarding her lifestyle, with some levelling accusations of illegitimacy against her second-born son. With Marie willing to become involved in politics, she wanted to improve her image. The diamond necklace affair occurred, which was a scandal at court, in which part of France's most valuable jewellery was virtually stolen. Tricks emerged, and it was levelled that Marie Antoinette's name was linked to the swindling of the jewellery, and this further enhanced Marie's negative reputation, despite her lack of involvement. Louis XVI often asked Marie for advice on politics, but there was a situation brewing between the Assembly and the King. But the major factor in the revolution was the financial problems in France. This was due to a number of expensive wars Louis took part in, a royal family who spent heavily, an unwillingness from the higher-up members of society to help out the lower classes. Marie became a target of disgrace, and when the revolution broke out, it had devastating consequences for the king and queen. The revolution in France had a number of key events that saw the monarchy overthrown. The storming of the Bastille was a sign of the king's decreasing power, and how the people could rise up and overthrow the monarchy, and the anger they had towards Louis and Marie, and the desperation spurred on the revolt. The revolution even forced the royal family to move out of their palace, and European powers sought to try and find a way for the French royal family to escape the anarchy. Several plots were drawn up, but the Queen rejected them, as she refused to leave without Louis, her husband. The royal family found themselves imprisoned, and on the 21st of September 1792, the National Assembly declared France a republic. Previously, an angry mob had broken into the French royal palace and insulted Marie and threatened to kill her, and there was bloodshed inside of the palace. With the declaration of the Republic, Louis was placed on trial and was sentenced to death on the 15th of January 1793. He was then 6 days later executed by guillotine in front of a huge crowd in Paris. The Queen, now a widow, was in great mourning. She hoped that one day her son would become king, however was a prisoner to the French people. Whilst imprisoned at the Tower of the Temple, she along with her children were insulted and kept under strict watch to ensure she could not communicate with the outside. Marie's fate after Louis's execution became a big question, with debate occurring as what to do with her. Others wished to have her executed, but some wanted her exchanging in a swap for French prisoners of war, or even sending to America. Decisions were made to retrain her son, the 8-year-old Dauphin, in the ways of the Revolution, and Marie was transferred from the Temple to a small cell in the Conciergerie. She was kept under constant watch and was given no privacy during this time. She was brought to trial by the Revolutionary Tribunal on the 14th of October 1793, and it's thought that the outcome had already been decided that she would be put to death. She faced a number of different charges, financial ones regarding her relationships, and even planning massacres. She was even accused of incest, but little could be done, and she was found guilty of 3 main charges: of the depletion of the national treasury, of conspiracy against the security of the state, and of high treason, and for this she was sentenced to death. She believed the worst she would get would be imprisonment, so the death sentence came at a shock. In her final days she wrote to her sister-in-law, expressing her love for her children and her devotion to Catholicism, and her will was made. In preparation for her execution, she was forced to change her clothes in front of the guards. She was forced to wear a plain white dress, although wished to wear a black one. Her hair was cut short against her wishes to ensure that the guillotine took her life without any issue. As she was taken out of her cell, she was bound with her hands tied behind her back, painfully hurting the former Queen of France. Marie was then placed on a rope lead and taken to her carriage. She was taken to her execution on an open cart, with it taking an hour to arrive at the Place de la Révolution. The crowds would have lined the streets as the slow cart moved throughout the city of Paris, and when she arrived at her execution site, the guillotine stood ready for her. At around 12:15 p.m. on the 16th of October 1793, Marie Antoinette stepped onto the scaffold to greet Charles Henry Sanson, a notorious executioner who took her husband's head 10 months before. He was stood in a black mask and probably never dreamed of the fact he would execute the Queen of France. As she approached the executioner, she stood accidentally on Sanson's foot and said, "Pardon me, sir, I didn't mean to." Whilst on the scaffold it was said she maintained her composure, but the crowd hurled insults and jeers at her. A priest accompanied her, and everything was ready for the Queen's execution. Minutes after she made her way onto the scaffold, she was placed onto the guillotine. Marie Antoinette's execution was remarkably swift, as was common with the guillotine, and her head was taken clean off by the blade. She would have been placed onto the board, then slid under the blade before it fell, and within seconds her head was taken clean off. Her head was then held up to the crowd, and Sanson proclaimed to the roaring crowd, "Vive la République." Marie Antoinette's remains were then taken to a graveyard behind the Church de Medellin, around a half a mile away. The gravediggers were on a lunch break, which allowed Madame Tussaud to take a wax imprint of her face before she was then placed in an unmarked grave. Decades later her body was exhumed and she was given a proper burial, and it was said that some of her white hair remained on her skeleton. Marie Antoinette was a very divisive figure in France, and the vast majority of the French population greatly disliked her for her lavish spending, all whilst the French were struggling to buy loaves of bread. She was a figure of the monarchy in France and became a controversial figure of the French Revolution. Some see her as a scapegoat, but what cannot be excused is the expense she spent on nonsense during her time as queen, gambling away thousands whilst everyone was suffering. Without Marie, there most probably would not have been a revolution in France. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.